They told me the woods were peaceful, quiet enough to hear your own thoughts, green enough to forget the city noise. I moved out of the city looking for that kind of quiet. I wanted trails, early light between trees, the kind of solitude that lets you breathe again. What I didn't expect was that the quiet would have teeth. This is 3 terrifying true tales from the deep woods that will haunt you. The ones that made me look at every shadow on a trail differently, that made me answer my front door with the chain in place, that taught me there are pockets of the world where normal rules fray. I told myself they were anomalies at first, coincidences, small-town stories. I kept telling myself that until the woods kept proving me wrong. I moved into a tiny town that looked like every postcard of rural America. Clapboard houses, a diner with a chipped sign, and a main street where everyone nodded but didn't pry. The woods started just past the last house, a thick, humped mass of trees that swallowed the light a few paces in. I walked them every morning. Sometimes I'd pack a small day pack, some water, and my dog, or no one at all. There was safety in the rhythm of footsteps, and the small map of trails burned into my head. There was one man who never fit that rhythm. People called him Hector. He wasn't the kind of person you forget, short and sturdy, with shoulders like a man who'd never learned to stop lifting heavy things. When he walked, he skipped, not a skip like someone humming on a sunny afternoon, more like a stuttered hop that made you look twice. He talked, too, mostly to himself, sometimes to the air. He'd sit outside the general store and speak in bursts, low and fast, like he was translating someone else's thoughts out loud. If you passed, he'd grin crooked and ask about the weather or about your sister, and then go right back to talking to someone only he could see. People in town had stories. That's what small towns do. They tell stories to fill in the blanks. They said Hector moved through the county like a ghost. He'd show up for a while, disappear for a month or two, then return without explanation. He was always polite enough, sometimes oddly helpful. He fixed fence posts for cash, shoveled for older folks. No one could say he did anything illegal, at least not for certain. But there was a hush in the diner when his name came up. Hush, and the kind of glance that says everyone knows a thing they won't say out loud. After a few months, I started seeing him on the trails. It was late morning on a weekday when I first heard him properly. I had been following a ridge I knew drew sparse traffic. Less shade, fewer people, more sky. The woods were full of the ordinary. A woodpecker tapping, leaves like dry paper underfoot, my breath in the cool air. Then I heard a rhythm that didn't belong to the forest. A short, impatient skipping, like someone bouncing on a cobblestone. I expected a runner. I expected boots. What stepped out into the path was Hector, his cheeks wind-burned, a scarf around his neck. He was talking to himself, jumping from voice to voice in the middle of a sentence. One line was pleading and small, the next cut sharp and angry. He slipped his head to one side and answered, then turned the other way and scolded someone else. I kept walking, not wanting to engage, but he looked up and his expression changed. The voices dropped away, and in their place was a blank, focused stare straight at me. "You're new," he said in his ordinary voice, like he was noting the weather. "Been here a few months," I told him. My dog sat like it knew to be polite. He tilted his head. "Trails get quiet," he said. "Sometimes the trees listen." It was a strange thing to say, and a stranger way to say it. I thanked him for the hedge he had mended weeks earlier, and pushed on, but a part of me stayed behind on that muddy path where he had stood. He had an odd way of belonging and not belonging at once, like a patch of wood missing a knot, obvious and uncanny. Over the following weeks I ran into him more. At the feed store, at dusk near the old mill road, at the cemetery, oddly. Each time he moved the same, skipping, talking, answering people only he could hear. He never looked like he meant harm. He looked mostly like a man comfortable in his own strata of reality. Then the day I heard the other voices came. I had gone deeper into the woods that afternoon than I usually did. The sky was a hard blue, and the trail narrowed, corralling me between tree trunks and ferns. The sound hit first as a trickle, snatches of conversation that could have been a radio left 2 valleys away. Then it braided into something else, many voices layered one on top of the other, different tones and ages, some whispering in panic. They weren't right next to me. I couldn't place them. I stopped and shut my eyes, trying to sort trees from noise from imagination. Ahead, in a shaded clearing, I saw him, Hector, standing with arms folded, though the most arresting thing was the way he shifted his weight and sounded like a room full of people. One instant his mouth formed a soft apology, the next it barked like someone in pain, the next it laughed low and ugly. He sounded like multiple people in one small man. I walked closer. He didn't notice for a while. He was on his knees then, like he was listening beneath the soil. He moved around as if following voices only he could track, ear cocked, lips moving. Then he looked up. For a breathless second, his eyes were nothing, and then, in a flash, he spoke, using not his voice, but a dozen. "Go," one said, brittle and cold. "Please," another begged. "I didn't mean it," a third moaned. It felt like someone had opened a radio and tuned every frequency at once. The hair on my arms rose. I stepped back, then turned to leave. He saw me. Everything shifted. The voices dropped, but not all at once. A low tone remained, like a foot dragging in a hallway. Hector's head snapped to me, and for the first time there was recognition in his face. It didn't take him long to cross the clearing. He moved fast, short, quick, a lit fuse. "You're trespassing," he said. Or rather, the words were his, but the cadence wasn't. He smiled like someone savoring a hunt. I started to walk away, slow at first. Then he began to run. It was not silent. His skipping turned into hammer steps. He yelled something that could have been a name or a threat. It echoed around the trunks like a thrown stone. I started to run, not thinking but feeling the absolute necessity of motion. The trail tightened. Roots hooked my shoes, branches scraped my arms. He was close enough to hear the rasp of his breath. It was uneven, like someone trying to accelerate on a broken motor. There are 3 moments I remember with a clarity that feels almost vulgar, because they are small and ordinary. The scrape of my knuckles against a sapling, the voice of a crow breaking the air like a warning, the taste of metal from adrenaline in my mouth. I didn't have a plan. I didn't think. I dove across a fallen log, rolled, and kept going. Behind me, he screamed. The sound wasn't human. It was layered. Anger and need and something that made my skin crawl. I reached the old mill road and ran until I could no longer hear him. I stopped at the shoulder, chest heaving, hands trembling. My phone recorded 1 bar of service and a missed call from Katie that I hadn't heard. I dialed 911 with shaking fingers. The dispatcher stayed calm. She said someone would be sent out. She asked me to stay put. I didn't stay. I had the irrational fear that standing would make me a beacon, so I drove. I drove to the sheriff's office like a panicked animal with mud on my shoes. The sheriff, Rogers, looked like he'd swallowed his sigh and was still digesting it. He took my statement with a polite, practiced patience. He said he'd heard of Hector, of course. Everyone had. At that moment, if he had the power to make my forehead crease into a line of worry, he did it. Rogers did not, in his professional voice, accuse Hector of anything. He used cautious phrasing. There had been an unsolved case years before. Remains had been found near a logging road that cuts through that same patch of woods. Hector had been seen around the time the remains were discovered. Hector had been gone when searches were most active. Those are the facts he shared. He also said he couldn't say more because the case was technically cold. No arrests, no charges. Just a trail of photographs and unanswered forms. "I can't tell you he did that," Rogers said, "but if he shows up near where you were, you tell me, even if it's just a weird feeling. People in these parts talk. Sometimes they know things and don't tell them because they don't want to be involved. I left the station with an official stamp of uncertainty in my pocket. The town was quieter as I drove back. The woods loomed. I kept checking my rear view. I kept the knives in the glove compartment where they felt absurd but necessary. Hector disappeared not long after that. There were a few fleeting reports. Someone saw him at the edge of town. Someone else said they had found his sleeping bag behind an old barn. But then nothing. It was like the world swallowed him. The hush that had shivered through the diner when his name came up deepened into something more like a protective silence. People moved differently on the trails. Neighbors started pairing up for hikes. I found myself walking with a compass on my wrist and a borrowed flashlight in my pack, even on bright afternoons. I never saw Hector again, at least not facsimile of the man I had known. Sometimes on the wind, when a branch creaks a certain way, I hear the memory of all those voices layered into one, and I freeze. I keep thinking about that day, the pleading and the command, the way he seemed to carry a crowd with him. I still can't say who that was in the clearing. A man with a fractured mind, a performer mimicking different characters, or something else that took a man as a vessel. The sheriff connected threads. The town whispered. I was left with a sinking sense that the woods were a place where oddities coalesced into patterns we weren't meant to see closely. A month after Hector vanished, someone found another set of bones. The papers called them partial remains and kept the location deliberately vague. The sheriff's office said they were following up on leads, but made the same careful, measured statements they always do. People in town nodded and lowered their voices. I kept hiking with a small, ridiculous knife clipped to my pack. When the sun fell early and the trail dimmed, I didn't go alone. If you like true stories with the creep turned up a notch, if this is the kind of thing you come here for, consider subscribing. I tell what happened. I gather what I can. There are more nights and more noises to cover. If you're new, stick around. If you're a regular, you know to lock the doors when you sleep. Whisper that to yourself as you walk out. We had planned the trip months in advance. 2 nights on a section of trail in upstate New York that promised cliffs and clear streams and a sky so thick with stars it made city living look like a bad dream. Katie and I set out with light packs, high spirits, and the smug confidence of people who believe roughing it is temporary discomfort. We were comfortable. We had maps. We had told friends where we were headed. The first night was ordinary in the way that ordinary comforts you into vulnerability. We set up camp near a creek. There was a ring of stones for a fire, and above us the trees knit tight like a ceiling. At some point we went to bed to the familiar chorus of insects and water, the kind of sound that makes you feel enclosed and safe. Katie fell asleep quickly. I lay awake longer than I expected, feeling the aftertaste of a good day and the feel of damp air on my face. Somewhere after midnight, Katie whispered. At first, I thought she was still half dreaming, the kind of sleep talk that pulls a person back into the warmth of the tent. She sat up, her hair a halo in the small beam of the lantern. "Do you hear that?" she asked. I listened. For a moment I heard nothing outside of the creek and the steady pulse of our breathing. Then, from somewhere beyond the ring of firestones, from between trunks that seemed to fold into each other, came the delicate, unmistakable sound of footsteps. Not big steps, but light, careful steps, the kind that make the ground dry with intent. Accompanying them, too soft at first to be certain, was a high, playful giggling, like someone at the edge of a game. I unzipped just enough to poke my head out. The night felt deeper than it had when we'd gone to sleep. Where the moon touched the trees, there were shapes, faint, shifting. The footsteps stopped, then resumed in a circle around our campsite, as if whoever was moving wanted us to know they'd been there and still were. The giggling came and went like a breeze. Katie's hand found mine in the dark. She whispered that it was probably kids. That thought was plausible and comforting. Teenagers messing around, daring each other to creep up on strangers, maybe starting a fire somewhere else. But our spot wasn't near any road. The nearest campers were a mile away. The logic didn't add up, but we told ourselves that the woods had an echo, and that sound distorted at night. Morning did not find the pranksters. Instead, it found an odd arrangement, 7 small stones placed in a neat circle about 20 feet from our tent, each one set atop a flattened leaf. Beside them were thin sticks bent into shapes and tied with strips of twine. It was deliberate, it was not random. The patterns were not like the marks of a child messing about. They felt careful, patient, meant to be seen and to be precise. I took photographs. Katie took a stick and nudged one of the stones. It was cold beneath the hands. The placement wasn't rough. It had the exactness of someone who had done this before, who knew what it meant for there to be order in the mess of the forest. We left the stones alone. There was a small, angry noise in my chest that I couldn't place yet, something that felt like trespass being upgraded to message. That night, the harassment escalated. There were footsteps again, only closer now, circling the tent in a rhythm we could feel more than hear. They tapped the fly of the tent with small, precise knocks. The first time it happened, I laughed in a way that wanted to be brave. It was childish. Harmless, I told myself. Then a voice threaded through a gap in the canvas. It said my name. My real name, said plainly enough that my heart staggered. Not a nickname, not a mumble. Katie and I both froze. The call was tender and knowing and impossibly intimate, like someone had memorized my face just to whisper at night. We yelled and unzipped. A pale shape stood 20 feet away under the trees. It was a young woman in a white dress that looked too clean for the forest. Her hair hung straight, and her skin had the sheen of someone who had been standing in moonlight too long. She smiled. When she unfolded her hand to wave, it was a small, practiced motion, casual, like someone greeting a neighbor. Her mouth moved, and she said my name again, as if to anchor me. Her voice was the strangest part. It was not malicious, not at all. It was oddly familiar, soft with an echo, like someone who had watched me from a place where I couldn't see them and learned the way I spoke. She knew my name the way a used-to-be friend knows the routine of your life. "How do you know my name?" I asked, voice sharper than I intended. It came out a mixture of anger and fear. She tilted her head. "I've been waiting," she said. Her words were simple. The way she said them was older than her face. She moved with a stillness that suggested patience. When she spoke my name again, it felt less like a human address and more like a key turning in a lock. The idea of a trick, the camp prank, faded then, not because the woman seemed supernatural, but because pranks don't usually come with such precise knowledge of your life. Katie whispered behind me, "Who are you?" But the woman didn't answer that. She said something else I couldn't quite pass, a whisper that might have been a fragment of a sentence, or might have been something else entirely. The woman smiled wider, up close now, and then, as if deciding something, she stepped sideways and vanished into the trees like a memory being erased. We didn't move at first. We listened for more sounds, for the rustle of a retreat or the crack of twigs. The woods kept their usual noises, water, insects, wind, but no footsteps, no giggling. The circle of stones remained. The sticks remained. There was a sense of having been measured and found incomplete. We left at first light, not daring to stay. The hike back was a slow, disbelieving march. I kept turning in my seat to look at the rearview mirror as if the white dress would step into the road and wave goodbye. We sat in silence for a long time once we reached the car. Katie's hands were white-knuckled on the wheel. She said it could have been someone in a rental, someone with a knack for mimicry, someone who knew my name through a friend of a friend. It was possible. We called the ranger station when we had decent reception. They logged our call. A ranger came by later that afternoon to look at the stones. He said he'd seen similar arrangements in other parts of the region, Some done by kids, some by artists, some, he admitted in a lower voice, that suggested practices he didn't want to name on the radio. He couldn't or wouldn't say more. The official line was neutral. They couldn't confirm anything malicious. Nothing was taken as evidence. But you don't forget the exactness of someone at midnight knowing the white of your teeth and the letters of your name. You don't forget a smile that isn't quite a smile, and a voice that sounds like an echo of someone who remembers you before you remember yourself. That night, back in town, I tried to make logical lists. Maybe it was someone we had crossed paths with who had internet stalking skills. Maybe it was a performance artist with an oddly sinister aesthetic. Maybe it was a devotee of some private ritual. I kept circling through theories until exhaustion pinned me down. There was a simple, hard truth under all the speculation. The woods had hosted a moment in which someone or something reached across the dark and addressed me by name. I couldn't place it in any category I trusted. We didn't go back to that campsite. We burned the little trip plans we'd made into a bonfire in the backyard and told ourselves we'd learned a boundary. We doubled locks, altered routines, and still the image of the pale dress lingered like a photograph. You can't quite show anyone because the details look wrong under light. That is where I will pause before the next night. I will say this: when something learns your name and acknowledges you in a space you thought you owned, even for a weekend, you look at every shadow like a ledger. You catalogue every sound, trying to match it to logic. You find yourself rehearsing the questions you wish you'd asked and the words you didn't have the courage to say in the moment. The thing in the white dress left with the woods. The stones and the tied sticks remained like punctuation, and the question of what kind of person could or would stand under moonlight and speak my name, I've been turning that question over ever since. There's more to tell. The third story has roots in a tradition, an annual trip with two guys I've known since before hair went grey, Theo and Carlos. We've always prided ourselves on being the kind of friends who make jokes in the dark, who call each other out for foolishness, who can laugh at the idea of a haunted cabin and then sleep through it. That night, what we found under a rickety floorboard turned that pride into something quieter. We were halfway through a long day of hiking when we stumbled on the cabin. It didn't look remarkable at first glance. Weathered planks, a sagging porch, a rusted stove through the curtainless windows. But its remoteness made it notable. It sat in a quarter of clearing the map didn't name, hidden enough that a creek and a felled log marked its distance from the trail. We joked about squatters, about eccentric hermits with chickens, about scenes from bad horror movies. We kicked the porch boards and debated whether to camp inside, like kids daring each other. Carlos found the loose floorboard. It was barely noticeable, a seam in the middle of the cabin where the wood had swollen and buckled. He pried. The board came up with a reluctant protest of nails and dust. Beneath, as if waiting for us to be interested, was a trapdoor, an inset hatch made of the same old wood but reinforced with a piece of metal. A smell crawled up. Cold air, like the inside of a refrigerator, and beneath that a sourness that made me step back. We called down at first, like idiots, like boys playing urban explorer. "Hello?" Theo's voice bounced back in a thin echo, swallowed by damp wood. No answer. We laughed and peered into the hole. It was darker than dark, the kind of black that erases depth. We propped a flashlight down and let the beam fall. The air that climbed the trapdoor was thicker than we expected. It smelled of earth and something else, old smoke maybe, or a closed room left to rot. We lowered the ladder. Theo grinned. He always does. The kind of grin that says he's about to do something to be regretted in a story later. He climbed down first. Carlos followed. I hung back, the polite one, recording with the phone because the whole thing felt like something to be captured and narrated later in the bar. Theo's light swept the room. The beam found a floor that had been trod into darkness. It found a crude chair. It found a man. He sat propped against the far wall, one shoe off. He had a limp that pulled his body to one side. He stared at us with a look that emptied the room of air. It wasn't a look of hatred or malice. It was a look that had given up the concept of being seen. His eyes were open, and they were the thing you cannot properly describe. They were awake and still like glass that didn't reflect back. He muttered something we couldn't hear. The sound wound up like a toy. His mouth made the shape of a sentence, and then stopped. There was a dragging in the floorboards behind him, like someone had been moving a foot all day. Theo took 2 steps back. Carlos watched him, face slack, and for a stupid, awful second we all thought him alive, so alive you could mistake it for something else. Then he moved. It wasn't a walk. It wasn't really a shuffle either. He pulled himself along, each movement a scaled-down version of a man's approach. He turned toward the ladder, and his head snapped up, following the light, fixing us with those hollow, patient eyes. We think about survival in clean terms when we're young. Run, hide, jump, push. We think in verbs. That day we had none of the practice. When the figure began to rise, when the sound of that single foot scraping the floor reached our ears with the intimacy of a neighbor's clock, the decision was simple. Get out. We scrambled. A ladder that seemed sturdy in the daylight felt thin and inadequate under the weight of 3 guys who'd only just decided the situation was dangerous. For a few seconds the world narrowed to the taste of dust in my mouth and the sound of bare feet hitting the porch above. We slammed the hatch shut and heard the thud of something heavy against the wood below. It was not a scream. It was not a plea. It was a sound like a person testing the ceiling, waiting for an answer. We ran. Outside the clearing felt wrong, too bright, too loud. We drove to the sheriff's office. We told them what we'd seen, a man in a basement, a limp, a stare like someone turned inside out. They took notes. They asked for descriptions. We gave them everything, hair length, clothes, the way he moved. They said they'd search. They said they'd check missing person reports. They found nothing. Not a single record matched the person we'd described. No missing person reports from the county. No pending alerts from neighboring jurisdictions. The area around the cabin had no recent permits, no caretakers. It was as if the person who had been sitting in that room slipped through the net of the ordinary. We went back once, after a week when the knot in my stomach had burned long enough I needed to see whether it had been a hallucination, a prank, someone looking to terrify city kids. There was no sign of the trap door when we arrived. The porch was sun-bleached and empty. The cabin's boards felt like the skin of a desiccated animal. We kicked again. The board we'd pried up had been replaced, nails gone in solid and neat. There were no resounding hollows. There were no scrapes of dragging feet. The clearing was only a clearing, and the only evidence of anything was the memory lodged in our chests. I have the memory of the eyes as something that lingers. They didn't have a story to tell. They didn't plead. They simply existed on the edge of a person who might be human and might be something else that looks human. The sheriff's office logged it, marked it down, and then marked it as unverified sighting. We learned to speak in those terms, careful, cautious. We learned that getting an official to acknowledge something can feel almost like a betrayal, because the acknowledgement rarely brings resolution. There's a shape this trio of stories takes in my head. A man who houses a crowd of voices, a woman who knows the sound of my name in the night, and a limping figure beneath a floorboard whose stare refuses to be humanized. Different moments, different places, linked by the same thing. Spaces we thought were ours, becoming the stage for something we didn't understand. They weren't all the same kind of threat. They weren't all the same kind of explanation. But taken together, they taught me to be wary of the wood's ordinary quiet. I won't pretend to be brave. I won't tell you there are answers. I will tell you what I know to be true. The woods are full of people and things that live there on borrowed time or on purpose. Sometimes they are harmless. Sometimes they are not. Sometimes they leave stones arranged in the morning and a wave from a white dress at night. Sometimes they skip along a trail and make you run for your life. There is one more thing I need to say before I stop for now. The stories don't end cleanly. They diverge into rumors, and he was seen, and she was reported to have been here. You stitch them together in the way people stitch together warnings. You tell them so you can feel like you are not the only one who felt the hair rise on their arms on some moonless night. And there is the memory of his skipping gait that replays in my head on nights when the wind wrenches the branches and the house settles. There is the circle of stones that might have been a child's prank, if not for the way the woman said my name. There is a basement where a man sat with lifeless eyes. I carry them like talismans I never wanted. I'm going to stop here for a moment, not because the stories end, but because the thing that happens next in the second tale is not something I can sum up easily. There are details that matter. How long we hesitated before stepping back into the tent, the way the moonlight fractured through the leaves when something moved behind our camp in the second night. The sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up in a new way. Those are the pieces that need the room to breathe, and they demand the next telling. Be careful. If you've ever had a moment in the woods where you felt watched, where a name on your lips suddenly belonged to someone behind you, tell me. Leave it in the comments. These things are worse when kept alone. They are less sharp when shared. I stayed awake for most of the night after we fled. Not because I thought the woman would follow us into town, she didn't, but because the idea of someone learning the sound of my name in a place I had owned for a weekend changed the math in my head. I ran through possibilities until the list exhausted me. A neighbor who knew too many mutual friends, some online stalker who'd traced a photo, an artist with a taste for theater. Each theory wanted to be neat. Each theory wanted proof. None of them fit the way the voice had folded around my name, like it had been waiting in the dark for the exact syllables. For days afterward, every small noise triggered the old night's choreography. A branch brushed the porch, and I flinched. A neighbor's truck idling down the street made my stomach clench because the cadence of a footstep isn't something you unlearn. Katie bore it with a steadier face than I had. Where I catalogued each sound into a list of dangers, she tried to make jokes about prankster students. It helped, but it didn't erase the way my mouth remembered that whisper. We went back once more to the trailhead, partly because I needed an answer, and partly because I wanted something to prove that what we'd experienced wasn't proof of pathology. The ranger at the station, he'd logged our call a week before, met us with the same flat eyes that come with too many reports and too little resolution. He showed us pictures of other stone circles he'd seen, circled by bored kids or by people doing folk art on a whim. He showed us nothing that matched the precise placement we found at our site. He said, cautiously, that people leave markers for all sorts of reasons, some of them harmless, some private rituals, some, he lowered his voice, things he wasn't comfortable discussing over the radio. Keep your distance next time, he said finally, as though that was the point. Don't be alone out there after dark. The problem with that advice, practical and reasonable, was that it didn't change the memory of her face in the moonlight. It didn't account for the way a person could appear at the edge of the woods, smile, and then recede like smoke. After that night, I stopped moving as freely. I stopped believing the trail was neutral ground. It felt, instead, like a place layered with other people's purposes. Weeks later, at a summer fair that had too much lemonade and too many families, an older woman who ran a small antique stall watched me for a long time as I moved past. She called my name, not because she knew me, but because she wanted to catch my attention, and in the second it took for me to turn, I felt the old pocket of ice open behind my ribs. She leaned in, lowered her voice, and asked if we'd ever found anything else near the creek. When I said no, she smiled like someone glad to hear a small denial. You two weren't the first, she said, not by a long shot. People see things. Sometimes it's lonely folks. Sometimes it's people trying to make the woods pay attention. Sometimes... She stopped, the sentence hanging like a damp cloth. Sometimes it wants a name to hold. It was the kind of thing that could be folklore. It was the kind of thing that could be wishful thinking. It also sounded like a warning dressed as gossip. Small towns have ways of saying the hard things without giving you anything you can take to a desk. There are practicalities after an experience like that. You learn to check locks twice. You leave lights on. You stop camping in empty clearings, even on trails you walked a dozen times. The stone circle added a new line to our mental checklist. If a place has been arranged with intent, leave. Don't poke. Don't photograph too closely. Respect the margin that people put around their rituals, even if you can't name them. But that rule doesn't help with the image that sits with you. Soft fabric in moonlight, a voice that knows the way you say your own name. That image is not a thing you can walk away from. It's the kind of small terror that wedges itself into the way you answer the phone. Months passed. The world insisted on its usual motion. Work, bills, neighbors' backyard barbecues, conversations resumed their comfortable orbit. The forest kept to its old rhythms until, on nights when the wind folded east, a memory would arrive like a small animal hopping onto the porch, a giggle behind the tent, the faint outline of a white shape between trunks. We told ourselves the reasonable things again and again until they sounded like liturgy. Sometimes faith in normalcy is all we have. That is when the cabin happened, when Theo and Carlos and I found a floorboard that didn't want to stay put, and a man who shouldn't have been there. For a while after the trapdoor, the three of us were quieter than usual. Our annual jokes turned brittle. We no longer mocked the idea of ghosts the way we used to. There's a humility that arrives after you see something that refuses to fit neatly into the things you already know. You learn to speak in soft, precise terms. Unverified sighting, possible misidentification, we can't find a record. Those phrases don't make you safer. They make you rational in public. The sheriff wrote us up, and the report sits somewhere in a file labeled with a date and a case number. They asked us for details. What time, what clothing, what we said. We answered as best we could. They promised to follow up. They came once to the clearing and looked around. Their boots crushed the leaf litter like small verdicts. They left with no answers and no leads. In the weeks that followed, the story mutated in the way these stories always do when they leave the lips of three men who want to be heard. It became a cautionary tale about curiosity. It became a barroom anecdote told with beer-sloshed bravado. It became, for some, a piece of entertainment. But the stare didn't leave. The more mundane the days became, the more that look settled into the corners of my vision like a bad photograph half exposed and fixed into place. It wasn't just the image of human eyes. It was the sensation that someone had been sitting in a room not wanting to be seen, and then had been seen anyway. There is a cruelty to being observed by something that offers no story in return. Stories at least make an exchange, promise a narrative you can hang on to. The limping man offered nothing but his presence. Theo was the angrier one afterward. Carlos turned inward. We didn't talk about returning to the cabin because the implication of going back felt like asking for permission to reopen a wound. We kept our tradition alive in smaller ways, trails closer to town, cabins that looked lived in, hikes with fewer blind turns. But the idea that there were places where things could be left to sit under a floorboard and be uncounted changed the way we planned everything. We were more careful with doors. We checked window latches twice. We slept poorly. People asked whether we'd seen the same pale woman Katie and I had seen. The answer was always no. It felt, on some level, like good fortune. The woods segmented their weirdness. It wasn't a single force patrolling all of the green. It was a scattershot of strangeness. Hector's skipping gait, the woman at camp who knew my name, the limping figure in the basement, 3 different distortions stitched to the same expanse. They shared a neighborhood and a capacity to unsettle me, but their logic remained private. This is the part of the story where some listeners look for a tidy thesis, some connective explanation that turns 3 anecdotes into a single moral. I don't have that. If anything, what ties them together is the failure of tidy explanations. The woods did not suddenly become supernatural because I saw three strange things. They revealed themselves as places where disorder could collect and wear human shapes. That is a less romantic ending than some would want, and it leaves you with a persistent uncertainty that is both interesting and exhausting. The sheriff's caution became a rhythm in the town. When something slipped into the margins, people talked around it. They named the strange things unsolved, or unverified, or local oddities. They warned their children to be careful, and then, in the same breath, told ghost stories to keep the tradition alive. We adopt rituals to make ourselves feel like there's an order bigger than random danger. We tell ourselves we are careful people with checklists. We sleep with phone chargers plugged in. We put porch lights on timers. These are small defenses against being noticed. You learn, too, how memory betrays and clarifies at the same time. Some nights, I can't remember the exact shape of the woman's smile. Other nights, I can smell the river they camped beside with a clarity that makes my chest ache. Memory rearranges itself into motifs. The skipping rhythm, the neat rings of stones, the dragged foot. Those motifs become talismans for me. Ways to recognize what happened without pretending to own it. Every so often someone in town will bring up a related story. An elderly farmer mentions a child who disappeared decades ago from further up the county. A woman in the laundromat whispers about a figure seen on a moonless road. These stories circulate like the wind in the leaves, sometimes useful, sometimes only a rustle. They never line up cleanly. Names are cautious. Dates unspecified. That hush is partly law, partly a local culture that understands the cost of prying too closely. It also keeps things ambiguous in a way that breeds unease. Uncertainty is fertile ground for fear. I don't mean to make the woods into a kind of villain. They are mostly ordinary. Trees, birds, paths. They are beautiful and necessary. But there are margins in every natural place. Corners where people leave messages, where loners carve their names into trunks, where someone might set a circle of stones and walk away. Those margins are where the ordinary and the strange overlap. That's where my three tales live. At the edges, where people with quiet, private purposes do things that trouble other people's night. When I tell these stories now, not everyone believes every word. Some nod politely and say they understand the feeling of being watched. Others meet my descriptions with skepticism and practical explanations. Both reactions make sense. I want to be clear. Belief is not the point. The point is the honesty of the experience, what it did to me, how it changed what I thought a walk in the woods could be. Those changes are real, whether the cause was human or otherwise. There is one last pattern to note. A small observation that keeps returning when I think of those nights. Things in the woods prefer small gestures. A skipped step, a carefully placed stone, a whisper of a name. None of these things are thunderclaps. They are small, precise touch points meant to be discovered by someone. That intimacy is what made the experiences so uncanny. It's easier to process wide, sweeping threats. It's harder to reconcile a tiny act that reaches into your life and leaves no clear trail. I still hike, of course. I still go out on days when the light is good and the air smells like leaf mold. But I'm different now in how I move. I plan routes with people in mind. I tell friends when I'll be gone. I avoid small clearings at night. When my dog pauses and stares at something off trail, I listen differently. I've kept the knife in my pack, not out of a belief it will save me from every danger, but because having it makes me feel like I have a small degree of agency in a world that showed me how little agency sometimes matters. And sometimes, late at night, there are moments of anger, not at the woods, not at the people, but at the way such small things can rearrange a person's interior life. I get angry at the idea that a simple weekend can become an axis around which months of worry rotate. I get angry at the way the town protects its secrets while offering little in the way of answers. That anger is practical. It is a rehearsal for a kind of insistence. Don't let this be the last you do. Tell it. Name it. Lay it out like a stone circle for other people to see. So here's my last practical thing. If anything in these tales rings true, if you've ever been called by name in a place you thought was safe, if you've found arrangements of objects left as if to say something, if you've seen eyes under a floorboard that didn't look like they belonged to a living story, tell me. Not because I can fix it, but because these things gather power in the dark when they are kept to yourself. They shrink when you throw light on them and say them aloud. Leave it in the comments. Tell the small details. Be as specific as you like about the feelings and the sounds, and not necessarily about places that require secrecy. If you want more of these kinds of stories, real experiences from the edges of ordinary places, subscribe. I gather them, I tell them, and I come back to the woods not because I'm brave, but because I want to understand what keeps showing up when the lights go out. Share this one with someone who loves the kind of story that won't let you sleep easily. And remember, when the woods go quiet and you start to relax, keep your name in your mouth for a moment. It's a small safeguard against being surprised. That's all for tonight. Thank you for listening, and please, if you've had a similar experience, tell it below. These things are worse when kept alone. They're less sharp when shared.